So in this final lesson, we're going to be asking ourselves, really, how do we know we're living in a simulation? Because in the last 4 or 5 lessons, we've been, outlining different arguments, outlining different critiques, and none of them have really come to the same conclusion. So we're going to recap the whole debate, and we're going to just ask, is it fundamentally unprovable to know if we're living in a simulation or not? And then we're going to have a look at the various different elements that can, the implications of computer simulations and the simulation argument as a whole. So as a recap, I've finally got my image of Inception here. There we go. That's what we've got here. Is a dream real? Or the dream is real, apparently. So in this course, we've explored the idea of us living in a simulation. And we have looked at Bostrom's simulation argument and the various critiques of it, specifically the idea that a simulation is unable to simulate consciousness. But then computational theory of mind suggests that maybe it can simulate consciousness if consciousness is just like a computer. And then you've also got the idea that, well, even if it can't, we could still just be a conscious brain in a vat, which would suggest that, that we could still experience consciousness and still be in a simulation. And we could also just be dreaming. That's another question that we have looked at in the last lesson, that we could be dreaming, and looked at some philosophers like Descartes and his view on dreaming. So, is it fundamentally unprovable? Can we ever know if we're living in a simulation? Okay. Fundamentally, is it ever impossible to know? For sure. Well, the most up-to-date philosophy on this topic really comes from Bostrom himself and a couple of others. So Bostrom himself argues that if we're in a simulated reality, there's no way to be sure that the beings running the simulation are not themselves a simulation, and that the operators of that simulation are not a simulation, and so on and so on and so on. So there are some aspects of the simulation argument and the simulation hypothesis that are unprovable, like, for example, this part. Okay. Is it possibly even dangerous to find out if we're living in a simulation? Now, this is an interesting question. In August 2019, the philosopher Preston Green suggested that it may be better if we never find out if we're living in a simulation. Let's just let's just live our lives as if we are or as if we aren't. Let's not even go into it and think about it. This is because he suggested that if we are living in a simulation and we find out that we're in a simulation, that might lead to the simulation ending. We could end the simulation by doing that. And his paper is actually quite interesting because it's titled, are we living in a simulation? That we best not try and find out, since the experiments will either be really boring or really dangerous. So he suggested that even if we are, then there's no point touching it. Let's stay away from it. So the idea as well that there might be some aspects of this that are unprovable really bring into doubt the question that the whole thing is unprovable. And it also suggests that it is unfalsifiable. The idea that we cannot prove it to be true or false. We can't prove it to be false. So therefore, we shouldn't really. It's effectively a meaningless conversation we're having. So, especially when we look at ideas such as the idea of us being a brain in a vat, or the ideas that we are dreaming, there's nothing to suggest that we are. There's nothing to suggest that we are not. It's unfalsifiable, and most suggest that some suggest that an unfalsifiable claim shouldn't really even be discussed in philosophy, seems that there's never going to be an answer to it. However, it does make for a very fun course, I'm not going to lie. There's also the idea of there being a religious element. Is there any kind of religious elements to the idea? Because there are philosophical and religious implications to us being a part of a simulation. Some proponents of the idea of a simulated reality have tried to tie the notion of a simulation to ask some more deeper philosophical questions about the existence of God, for example. And if God exists, does that mean he is the creator of this simulation? Or if we're in a simulation, does that mean that the creators of the simulation are gods by definition? These are all very interesting, very deep philosophical questions, and I'm going to posit some of these in the project section for you to really discuss in a lot more detail, because adding a religious element to it really does tie into it makes it an even broader and deeper philosophical problem. As a course summary, we're going to just recap everything that we have learnt in this course. So effectively the conclusion that I'm going to come to is that we may or may not be living in a simulation. I would tend to lean towards the fact that we maybe are living in a simulation, just because that makes it more fun, fundamentally, at the end of the day. But despite the fact that we haven't come to a definitive conclusion, we have looked at some very interesting contemporary philosophy on this issue. So we've looked at the argument by Nick Bostrom, the idea that people are living in a simulation. We've looked at the various critiques of that argument. And we've looked at the idea that none of the critiques of the simulation argument can disprove the idea that we are at least somewhat simulated, that we could be maybe a brain in a vat, or that we could be dreaming. There's nothing to suggest that those are not possible alternatives. And there's also no way of knowing if we're dreaming, like I've just mentioned. Okay, and fundamentally, at the end of the day, there might not be any way of proving for sure we're a simulation in the first place. But at the end of the day, the more we know about this, then we could come to a point where we do find out. Because don't forget, just because there's no way of knowing right now, that doesn't mean there's no way of knowing in the future. There's nothing stopping us from finding out. There's nothing, logically impossible about coming to a conclusion on this. And that's what's really exciting. That's what's really exciting about these things is there may be an answer in the future. There's nothing suggesting that there will never be an answer to this. And that's really why it's fun to be at the cutting edge of philosophical debate. So I'd like to say thank you all for watching. If you want to go into a little bit more detail on the idea of computers and the computational theory of mind, I've done a course on the philosophy of artificial intelligence. If this course has made you feel all existential about who you are and your place in the world, then I've actually done a course on personal identity. And if you want to look at the ideas of Descartes and the ideas that our senses can be fooled, I've done a course on the philosophy of perception, and I've also done a couple of courses on the ideas of Stoicism and on logic as well, and I plan to do many more interesting courses on consciousness and the mind and metaphysics in general. So stay tuned for those. Thank you very much for watching, and be sure to do the project section down below.